In Chapter 5 of Carol Oja's book, Bernstein Meets Broadway, the musicologist discusses one of the key facets of the original stage production, how they handled race relations. Rather than focusing solely on the creative team, she traces the path of all those involved through the preceding cultural events of the war years. While there had been mixed casts before, they were typically segregated on and backstage. Additionally, the parts of minorities were very small and tended to fall back on the damaging stereotypes popularized by minstrel shows, vaudeville, and other popular culture of the time, with major roles being handed off to the white members of the cast. Instead, all the town was integrated on and backstage and was careful to fall back on these stereotypes. While only one of the 6 leads was a minority, Sona Asato, original run, those in the chorus had large roles. Additionally, integration was presented as something that was unremarkable and part of everyday life. However, while they were integrated, they still had to follow at least some of the customs for the time period in order to have at least some of an audience. And they were very careful to not go too far past the bounds, resulting in a production that was so understated in its integration that it ceased to be remarkable, at least by the white mainstream media. Now let's look at the production team that brought the musical together. George Abbott was the senior on this fledgling team and was an esteemed director on the world of Broadway, and though a traditionalist, knew how to find the best talent and create good productions. He additionally gave them the much needed clout and status so they could secure funding. However, he seemed to provide the voice of moderation and perpetuation of the status quo, resulting in the cut of several dance sequences that were considered to be too taboo for even the most progressive of New York audiences. Leonard Bernstein, the composer, was only classically trained, but had great fascination with jazz and other parts of the African American idiom. While at the Curtis Institute of Music, he was excited at the possibility of conducting an all-black symphony orchestra as part of an effort by the National Negro Congress, which was the primary civil rights organization to warriors, helping to coordinate the efforts of the NAACP and other groups to help promote racial equality. The NNC also had a performance committee who was focused on bringing equality through performance in the theater, music, and other parts of cultural life. Robin's ties to the NNC were unknown, but he was aligned with Asato and DeMille, who were tied. Additionally, Asato, DeMille, Bernstein, Green, and Compton all had ties to the Communist Party. Unfortunately, Robbins had to eventually testify between the House Un-American Activities Committee in Congress, where he had to make the choice whether to reveal names of other people who had supposed communist influences. Like I said before, Bernstein, Robbins, Asato, Green, and Compton had strong ties to the Communist Party, as evidenced by their support of the re-election of Benjamin J. Davis, an African-American lawyer and civil rights activist, a member of the Communist Party, to the New York City Council. Bernstein, Green, and Compton had special sympathy to the plights of African Americans due to the parallels between that and the trials of the Jewish people. Betty Compton and Aldous Green were the lyricists in charge of writing the book for On the Town, and would later go on to work with Bernstein in many other productions, along with Robbins. For Condon and Green, desegregation was central to their work with the reviewers, and they maintained a firm commitment to furthering racial justice through performance throughout their careers, as seen in their involvement in the concert From Swing to Shostakovich at Carnegie Hall in 1943, which was one of the first mixed-genre, mixed-performer concerts at the institution, and Hallelujah Baby in 1967, which the Chicago Defender reported as being the American Negro struggle from the days of slavery to contemporary times. Looking at the work of desegregation on and backstage, the efforts seem to have been mixed. In the case of Sono Asato, her role was eventually taken over by Alan and McClarick when the production went on tour, because Asato had prior commitments. However, Asato did come back in order to do the cast recording and was honored, along with the rest of the cast, by Mayor LaGuardia, who signed a copy of the recording, produced by Victor Records. Everett Lee, the violinist who Bernstein had tapped to come and play in the pit orchestra for the production as concertmaster, had eventually taken over as conductor for the pit orchestra, being the first African American to do so, and knew Bernstein through their mutual friend Muriel Smith. Muriel Smith was the first African American woman to study at the Curtis Institute of Music and was a classmate of Bernstein. Maurice Wallace was a dancer and artist who already had some acclaim despite her young years. Even though she was in the chorus, her poster was featured prominently in the theater lobby. It was noted by critics as being one of the few, if any, of the African American cast members who could have been readily identifiable because of her poster. As the play progressed, the leads were chased by various people who they had angered through committing various crimes and being general public nuisances. The first police officer seen chastising the group was Lonnie Jackson, who, according to Oja, had authority over white citizens and white members of the military. This was a feat that was heretofore unknown in America at that time, as police officers, if there were, African American police officers generally patrolled the neighborhoods populated by those of their same ethnicity. However, in the final 3 segments of the chase sequences, he was joined by Roger Treat, a white actor, resulting in the image of a mixed-race team of cops, something that was completely unheard of. On the other hand, there were 2 scenes, the presentation of Miss Turnstiles and a dance sequence with 3 members that was ultimately scrapped. In the presentation of Miss Turnstiles, Asato was supposed to dance with 6 different male members of the cast, showing her conflicting talents and parts of her personality. One of the cast members, the fellow wearing a zoot suit, was originally supposed to be played by an African American man. However, this was switched to a white actor. At the time, integration meant that African Americans would be dancing with white people and Asian people would be dancing with white people. Asian and African American actors dancing together was considered to be far too progressive, even for New York. If the Miss Turnstile scene was considered bad enough to be changed, the sequence that would later be scrapped was even worse. As originally part of the Dream Ballet sequence, Asato was supposed to dance with Flash Riley and Frank Neal, which was also scrapped for being too progressive, upon the recommendation of George Abbott. As can be seen, while there were significant efforts to try to promote integration and racial equality both on and off stage, as with the integration of the dressing rooms and the posters and roles on stage, they still had to conform to the status quo of the times. Critics and scholars' reaction to On the Town's original run was mixed. As I mentioned before, white critics on mainstream newspapers such as the New York Times either were oblivious or completely ignored the integration efforts that were being seen on stage, instead of commenting on the fusion of high and low art, as can be seen in the inclusion of opera buffa, Tin Pan Alley songs, ballet, the jitterbug, and various other art forms. However, not everybody ignored it. The African American newspapers such as the Chicago Defender and the Amsterdam News took great notice of how On the Town was treating its mixed cast, and were generally pleased with the results, though they did experience some reservations. Amsterdam News' critic Joe Bostic was featured prominently throughout the chapter, first writing about how mixed-race casts were usually seen as novelty acts and not seen as anything normal, but by the end of it was seen to be relatively impressed with how the show had turned out, showing the efforts of Sono Asato, Lonnie Jackson, and various other performers in how the show managed to achieve the ideal of an integrated society. However, he did make the note that it was still a step in the right direction, but not an overall game changer. Another quote of note came from the Daily Worker. Everett Lee, the violinist and conductor I mentioned earlier, had declared that the show had done some splendid pioneering work on Broadway. Beth McHenry, the reporter with the Daily Worker, expounded on the statement. The integration of Negro artists with others in the cast of On the Town, not in the usual specialty number category, but in the regular assembly of dancers, was was a sight to see. Mr. Lee attributes this to the honest and democratic ideas and efforts of the musical's authors, Betty Compton and Adolph Green, and to the cooperative efforts of the whole cast. He himself was urged to come work on the show by Leonard Bernstein, the composer. On the Town was wildly successful during its original Broadway run, running for 14 months and having over 400 performances. Therefore, they took the show on the road. By today's standards, the show's original traveling production was kind of limited, only going to 4 different cities: Ford's Theater in Baltimore, Forest Theater in Philadelphia, Nixon Theater in Pittsburgh, and Schubert Great Northern Theater in Chicago. This was just as well, with a chorus that was still integrated, albeit with all the leads being white. It would have been difficult to book theaters for performances south of the Mason-Dixon line, let alone having as receptive an audience. In fact, Baltimore was the only southern town on the tour, but the city had a quixotic relationship with race, seeing as it had strong Unionist sympathies in the Civil War only 80 years prior. During the Baltimore run, it appears that African American members of the cast had to stay in private homes due to the segregation laws at the time. Despite this limited tour, by today's standards, the tour was successful, going on for 4 months. In addition to the tour and the Broadway run, the cast did a series of performances for the military with help from the USO and at the Grand Canteen. Additionally, the cast, with the addition of Broadway star Mary Martin singing the role of Gabby, made a series of cast recordings that promoted the longevity of On the Town's run. Cast recordings, now a staple in our musical culture, were a relatively new phenomenon at the time. The show was so successful and so highly regarded that it was even presented to Mayor LaGuardia by Leonard Bernstein and Sono Sato in a ceremony in New York City. When they decided to make On the Town a film that year, they made some significant changes. The cast and the chorus was changed to being all white, and much of the singing and dancing was cut out. In fact, a lot of Bernstein's original music had been cut as well, and the choreography that had been originally designed by Robbins was replaced by choreography by Gene Kelly. This compounded the problem of racial erasure. On the Town was hardly a game changer in terms of desegregating and ensuring equitable treatment in Broadway and in broader American society. That struggle is still taking place today. But it was another step in the right direction. The management sought to oppose prevailing racial practices on stage by learning from the show's immediate predecessors, which offered models that alternately inspired, changed, and perpetuated the status quo. Additionally, they were working with an integrated cast, all of whom had broad experience in the theater, modern dance, ballet, and performing as musicians in a variety of genres, who were just as determined to achieve the stated objective. The production team's decision about what the black actors did on stage and backstage showed sensitivity about depicting a mixed citizenry, but steered clear of being overly provocative. While Oja did cite the collaborators likely tied to the cultural division at the National Negro Council, I personally think it had much to do with the clashes in personalities between the more progressive voices in Bernstein, Compton, and Green, the modern Robbins, and the traditionalist Abbotts. with their alignment with the Progressive Arts Group on how the show made its debut. In the end, Oja and other writers relate that the focus on race was so understated in On the Town's debut that it ultimately proved to be ephemeral. When the hit was made into a film the following year, it had an all-right cast, which completed the erasure.